Professor Anderson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, would you like to share a brief introduction with listeners about your work, yourself, and how you got interested in exploring MCS?
Yeah, I've been working with this for more than 15 years. I started my PhD thesis in 2006. And by that time, I had a master's in cognitive science, which is mainly based in neuroscience and sensory psychology and these kinds of stuff. I hadn't really a notion of sensory intolerances or chemical intolerance or multiple chemical sensitivity at all. But I had a supervisor who really encouraged me to go into that direction because there was so little empirical data on that large public health concern. I can also say that a main concern for me and my colleagues has always been to find out what it is that causes the reactions. So we have tried to single out the kind of exposure that people with MCS actually react to. And we have looked at the systemic reactions in the blood. We have looked at mucosal inflammation. We have looked at changes in brain activation patterns and so on. It's a pressing concern. If you compare it with other large public health issues, MCS is the research is almost non-existent and still is because I don't really know, because you have a lot of patients. And I think that I still cannot really understand why it is disregarded in the medical community.
All this is so fascinating, and I'm so pleased to have found your research and that you're taking time to speak with us because your knowledge is so important. And it's true. I spend a lot of time looking at research and there's so little of the nature that you're doing. And I wonder if you may have had a moment, perhaps, when you thought, hey, why is no one doing this before? Why is
Yeah.
no one doing this? What did you have a moment like that?
Yeah, I've had several. My main kind of collaborator is a close colleague of mine called Anna-Sara Claesson, who has a background in chemistry. I mean, we are a multidisciplinary group, and I would say that this is necessary when you go into this kind of research. We all know that it's tricky to pin down. If it would have been easy, we would have already solved the enigma of the multiple chemical sensitivity. But we haven't. And one reason I think is that you need to have a quite sophisticated laboratory, and you need to have a lot of different research backgrounds to be able to tease out the reactions. When I look at the scientific literature, I am struck with one thing that is still true, I think, and that is that there are a lot of different labs that have tried to do exposure studies to understand the symptom reactions. One problem is that they seldom do more than one study. So they try out an idea, but it's very difficult. You have several different forms of these reactions in MCS patients. So one person may not be the same as another. And when you clump them together, it may be that kind of the effect is dispersing. So even though you may trigger a few of these persons who are part of your participant group, some may not react to that exposure. And you get the, in my view, incorrect impression then that this is not a true stimulus response relationship. And by that, I mean that when we try to trigger reactions, we only find reactions in some of these individuals. So I would say that it's so complicated that a lot of researchers tend to give up. And it can be because there isn't that much funding, and it's also quite complex to go about it. I have had the privilege of doing this repeatedly, but I still feel the problems of pushing this forward, because I would say that my first studies were not particularly good. But when I go into my fifth or sixth or seventh study, now we're getting somewhere. I feel more comfortable having an overview of the kind of reactions that I may encounter in my laboratory work.
Yeah. So you mentioned, and we know people react in different ways. MCS affects many different systems in the body, respiratory, cognitive, psychological, emotional, neurological, and more. And also the reactions can be delayed.
Yeah.
For example, many times, I know most of my reactions begin 3 hours after exposure. So that presents a problem too. Professor Andersson, I want to invite you to talk a little bit about the motivation. You mentioned that it's a significant public health. You didn't use the word crisis, but it's a significant public health issue. In the part of the world where you are based, in Sweden and Scandinavia, Europe, if we extend, how significant is the problem of multiple chemical sensitivity and why?
Yeah, so I think it's a brilliant question, and one that actually has a relatively simple answer. So it is when you do these kind of prevalence estimates, and by prevalence, how common it is, you first encounter one problem, and that has to do with how do you go about and ask people about their MCS status? Because in many cases, you do not have a kind of standardized criteria for asking that question. So it's a bit difficult to compare how it is in the United States as compared to Great Britain or Sweden or Japan, for instance. But we do actually have prevalence numbers, and we can, when we boil them together, we get a kind of a similar pattern of prevalence. So a few percent of the population, which is true both in the United States and in Europe, for instance, have a severe form of MCS or chemical intolerance, depending on what label you want to use. And surprisingly, about 10% have report reactions that are so severe that they negatively impact people in their daily lives on a regular basis. So this is not just a fringe situation, in my opinion. You actually have a lot of problems tied to these kind of symptom reactions following chemical exposure. Yeah, quite similar across the world.
Did you say that 10% of the population in many countries experiences severe, debilitating forms of multiple chemical sensitivity, chemical intolerance? 10%?
I wouldn't perhaps say debilitating, but I would say that it impacts them when they go about their everyday life. So when they pass perfume counters in downtown areas, when they go to a movie, when they try to get on a bus or something like that, when they go to the gym, they do feel that they actually get quite nauseous or get headache or whatever when they encounter people with a lot of perfume and so on.
The range of symptoms, more than headaches. And so 10% of the global population.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
So we're about 8.5 billion people on the planet. Do you have a sense of a rough number of how many people have this illness? And is it one of the most significant and growing public health issues?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that one out of 10 persons, that is not an kind of a exaggeration necessarily. Of course, you can ask how great are their problems, but nevertheless, when you actually ask the question and you take them and their answers at face value, this is a concern in their everyday lives and when they work and so on. And I've done this for 15, 20 years. When I speak about these problems to almost any audience, I do get that kind of prevalence estimates in my small sample, so to speak. So a few people actually says, yes, I actually have this problem. And a lot of these persons do not have the severe MCS symptoms, but it's a problem in their everyday life. And I think there are reasons to get to the bottom of why this is the case. And given, I will also say one additional thing. So I think that it is also pertinent to regard this as a kind of a spectrum that we basically should expect, because a lot of people, they place themselves somewhere along this line.
Understood. So there's a range of severity. And I've come across studies, and people will be familiar, for example, studies by Dr. Claudia Miller and Shahir Masri and colleagues who write that in the US, it's in the range of 10 to 27%. but not all experience the severity, the maximum level of severity. For countries in the global south, for example, developing countries, one could imagine that the rates of chemical intolerance are also significant, but we hear a lot less, very infrequently, about chemical intolerance in developing countries. Do you have any sense of the scale and scope of the issue in those countries?
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting to take a step back and consider how researchers saw asthma and allergies in the 18th century. They regarded that as a disease of modernity. And in many cases, that is also true for MCS. So there is this impression that MCS symptoms is only expressed in developed countries. But I would say that is based on a lack of data rather than actually having done data collections in other countries. So I know for a fact that there are a number of very nice studies from Cambodia, for instance, where they follow people who fled from the Khmer Rouge. And a lot of these patients have severe forms of MCS. So I wouldn't be surprised if we found comparable prevalence numbers across the globe.
And it's also a question of regulation, right? And we know that the regulation on chemicals can be much less stringent in the global south as well. But I want to just come back to your research. So you mentioned your research is focused on three things, right? The relationship between exposure and symptom. So what's happening in the body? And I want to ask you more about what you theorize is happening in the body. And also, secondly, can we develop a valid, reliable, usable test? And third, can we treat reactions? So if it's okay, I'd like to start with number 3, because there isn't a recognized treatment. We learn from each other, we try different things, but there isn't a cure. Some people say there are even no effective treatments. So how can we treat these reactions?
Yeah, if I had an answer to that, I would readily give it to you. I would say that is the final step. Or if I have the answer to that question, I'm done, but I'm not done yet. So I would say that nevertheless, I think first of all, you need to consider that there are many different subcategories probably of MCS. Like you said, the way you react to chemicals, for instance, may not be the same as the others. So if you get an exposure, for instance, the reaction may be delayed for a long time, whereas others react instantaneously. So I have a few patients who, if I were to use chemical, for most people, relatively weak exposures, but for them it's not weak. So I expose them and I can see within perhaps 20 seconds that they get a rash and the redness in the skin and so on. So for these people, the follow-up question is, are their reactions the same as your reactions? That is an open and empirical question. And it's not necessarily the case that we should treat you as having the same kind of symptomology here. The first thing we need to do is to establish some kind of pattern of reactivity. Imagine, if you will, how you go about when you have an allergy. Summer is coming here in northern Sweden, also to us, and I have a lot of pollen problems, but I don't actually know which pollen. I think it's birch, but it could be anything, basically. And I take my medicines and it gets a bit better. But if you were to ask me, what kind of pollen do you actually react to? I don't know. And for many chemical intolerance patients, they may say, when I sniff this perfume, I react to it. But the perfume contains hundreds of compounds. So it's difficult for them to single out the triggering reaction. What we try to do is to single out that particular reaction. And for you, Aaron, it may be one thing, and for another patient, it may be another. But the idea is, if we can do a triggering palette in the same way that you go about in allergy, if you do allergy testing like the skin prick test and so on, you can see what kind of allergens that you react to. My hope would be to develop something similar, have a palette of compounds that may paint the picture of your particular pattern of reaction. And when we have that, I would say that we have a greater kind of foundation to build our understanding on. And with our expertise in chemistry and also in sensory neuroscience, we can tease out the different parts of receptor systems and defense mechanisms in the periphery of the body, like the skin and mucosal membranes and so on, and also the receptors and the nerves and how these relate to systems underlying inflammation and so on. Then we can begin our work to try to tease out some kind of way of alleviating the symptoms.
Oh, we
It
look
could be,
forward to that.
yeah, and it can be quite different depending
Mm-hmm.
on the pattern of reactivity. So if you have a severe headache, if you trigger the so-called trigeminal system, it's a part of the sensory system within the nose that mediates pungent sensation. So if you sniff a Coca-Cola and you feel the kind of the tingliness, that is actually a trigeminal reaction. If you eat chili peppers and you feel a burning in your mouth, that is also a trigeminal and not taste and not smell sensation, so on. So I do think that some people actually have these kind of reactions, exacerbating their system and their symptoms, whereas others react to mainly olfactory or having to do with the sense of smell reactions. And some cannot even say what kind of exposures it is that triggers symptoms. So they come into a room, for instance, and they begin to get red in the face and they don't feel anything. So treating these different groups as their own kind of expressions, I think, is key to understanding both the mechanisms and to develop a treatment for it.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to just invite you to break these down a little bit. So in your research, you explore the role of, you mentioned the olfactory nerve, right? Which is related to the sense of smell, but it doesn't mean that people with MCS have a more acute sense of smell, correct? Because we know that, but we're often misdiagnosed with something called hypersomnia. Is that correct? But we don't have that. No. Do you want to talk about that?
Hyperosmia. Yeah, exactly. So taking a step back, I think that we need to consider what it is that patients with MCS actually react to. And the answer to that is chemical compounds, and most often airborne chemical compounds. So it's not, if you eat something that is made out of salt, it's not the salt and the heavy compounds that aren't airborne that you react to. So for some, the compounds need to be in the air. And another thing we need to consider is that it is not the case that the same chemicals trigger the same reactions in everyone. So if you are in a conference room and some people have perfume, it is only the people with MCS who will get symptom reactions. So that means that it could be that if we increase the dose of the exposure, everyone actually gets reactions because it may trigger some kind of reaction at high levels. But the key to MCS symptomology is people react to levels that are below what is regularly considered to be a problem. I mean, it is obviously a problem for people with MCS, but not for the majority of people. So that kind of paints a conundrum. And a follow-up question is then, what is it that they react to? What is the necessary conditions to mediate this airborne kind of volatile organic compounds or molecules that is in the air in a way that triggers reactions? One way could be that it is not necessarily having to do with our chemical senses, which is part of our mouth and our nose and so on. It could be that it has to do with mucosal membranes, for instance, or the skin and so on. We don't really know because we haven't really tested it. I had a colleague in the hospital here actually trying to dip small paintbrushes and kind of paint chemicals on the face and see the reactions in a way that you often do in kind of contact allergy and so on. And I think that is a feasible way of going about this kind of research as well. What I have been focusing on is the sensory systems within the nose and also the mucosal membranes and the kind of receptor systems in the eye and so on, because a lot of people also get problems in their eyes and so on. When you go into the nose, you have not only one sensory system. We often consider olfaction, the sense of smell, to be the system of the nose. but we have at least one other sensory system, which is called the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve, or the chemostasis nerve, goes from the brainstem out into the face, into the mouth area, and also in the nose. So like I said, when we consider the reactions to pungent sensations, that is the trigeminal nerve. And the olfactory nerve actually does not go to the brainstem. It goes up from the nasal mucosa up to the olfactory bulb and back into the brain. So a lot of people don't know the difference between those two systems because they are felt in the same way. But it could be that for some, the reactions are mediated by trigeminal reactions, and for some, could be that it is mediated by in the olfactory system. A follow-up and important question that I don't really have the answer to: is it necessary to have a sensory system that is triggered by the chemical exposure? Or can you have a reaction even though you actually don't smell anything or sense anything? And I don't really know. But I would say, and it's not that I haven't tried it, it's just that it's a really tricky thing to study. So my field of research has mainly had to do with exposures that people can actually perceive. So
Yeah.
perfume
Interesting.
and detergents and
Yeah.
trigeminally, active compounds.
Yeah.
And those, I would say, is also by the sufferers themselves, the kind of exposure that they regularly react to. Some patients can come into a room, they don't feel anything, but they just get a rash. So it could be
Yes.
something like that. And then the question is, what is it that kind of triggers that reaction? Is it still the sensory systems kind of?
Yes.
I don't really know.
It's a very interesting question, and it makes me think of when I first developed a severe MCS. I was living in Bangkok, Thailand, and it was the condominium building where I was living was regularly, I think on a weekly basis, someone came in and sprayed the hallways. And even in my apartment that I didn't know at the time was accessing my suite when I wasn't home. And I would come home and have very serious reactions. But of course, I couldn't smell it. So it's not an olfactory issue, but is it? You talk about olfactory, trigeminal nerve, and you also write about the neurogenic inflammation.
Yeah.
You think that's what was going on with me? Was I having neurogenic inflammation? I know you can't say it definitively, but what do you think?
Yeah. So if we wrap up kind of the story about the sensory systems, you need to consider that we often speak about peripheral systems, what happens in the mucosal membranes and what happens in the skin and so on. And we separate that from what happens in the brain. But from a biological perspective, this is a kind of integrated system. So the nerves going from your kind of facial area and so on, it's not a different kind of nerve than the one that is active in the brain. And that is one reason why we look at what happens when the signal reaches, what happens at the peripheral level, what happens when the signal reaches the branching connections into the brain. We believe that there may be something along all these kind of pathways that is a problem. And one of the theories that you mentioned now is neurogenic inflammation. And I have devoted a lot of time to tease out what people actually mean when they express theories like neurogenic inflammations and so on. And I would say it's not that easy to actually tease out what neurogenic inflammation would actually be. So neurogenic inflammation and many other theories of multiple chemical sensitivity is in themselves a bit circular. So you say, okay, the symptoms in this patient or in this group of patients has to do with neurogenic inflammation. And that is what kind of exacerbates and triggers a symptom reaction that it is growing worse as time progresses. And then you ask, what is neurogenic inflammation? And when you scratch the surface, it is a circular argument that it is a time-dependent increase in the firing rate of certain neurons, like the trigeminal neurons. But I mean, that was kind of the definition. You cannot have the definition and the explanation at the same time. But it could be nevertheless something there. So neurogenic inflammation is difficult to pin down because it is difficult to measure neurogenic inflammation. First of all, if you don't really know what to look for. And second of all, how do you actually measure it in a living organism like a person? How do you go about to tease out the neurogenic inflammation? Is it impossible? No, I actually don't think so. But we don't really, me and my colleagues are not really, we begin with the basics, the empirical data. Then we consider how are these related to the explanatory theories, like neurogenic inflammation or neurosensitization, like a host of different explanatory theories. What we almost always find is that the theories are so broad that everything that we find can be seen as a kind of evidence for a particular theory. So if we would find a heightened reaction in some kind of nervous system, it could be seen as evidence for the neurosensitization theory. It could be seen as evidence for the neurogenic inflammation theory. It could be seen as evidence for it's not really new, but prediction model theory. It could be seen as Martin Powell's idea of the oxidative processes going on in the brain. And the reason for that is, in my opinion, the theories are so broad that they are almost impossible to falsify. What we try to do is to pin down what could be a reasonable marker that nevertheless says something about what has happened for you in terms, for instance, that kind of still captures what is meant by neurogenic inflammation. I mentioned one of the receptor systems that I think you actually asked me about also, and that has to do with the transient potential vanilloid receptor systems, the TRP1 receptors. So on these kind of trigeminal nerves that mediates pungency and reactions to chili peppers and so on, there's a lot of different receptors. And when a molecule like capsaicin, which is the hot substance in chili pepper, attaches itself to this receptor, it impacts the trigeminal nerve. And the question then is, can TRP receptor expression be a reason why some people actually get these reactions? It's expensive and difficult to do studies like that. But we have tried, and we do think that this is a feasible way and a very interesting way in the future, because that kind of receptor system may very well be a pathway to understanding at least some reactions in MCS patients. So that is something that me and Anna Sara, my great colleague and friend, are trying to actively see if we can do a study about.
It's very complicated, so I'm very grateful to you for the research you're doing and for sharing it with us in a way that's comprehensible. You mentioned the biomarker tests, biological tests to show that people have MCS. This is really fascinating. And I think a lot of people with MCS long for such a test to be available to the public, because what would that do? It would help to validate our experiences. It would really show that, no, this illness is not in our heads. We don't have psychological disorders. This is a physiological illness. Could there be a biological test for MCS?
There's a very simple answer and a complex answer. The very simple answer, which is nevertheless true, absolutely. More complex question is that I think we need to consider that the kind of distinction between biological and psychological explanations or problems are made up in a way. So if we scratch the surface, we know that any kind of symptom reaction, by definition, must have a physiological counterpart. If we don't acknowledge that, we are basically dualists. We're saying that there are two kinds of suffering. It is one that has nothing to do with the body, and one that has something to do with the body. But I don't adhere to that kind of distinction, because for almost all diseases, you have one physiological part, one bodily part, and one psychological part. And that is true for almost all symptoms. So if you break your leg, for instance, the obvious physiological problem is you have a broken leg. And the psychological aspect of that would be the pain that is, and the problems walking that has to do with the broken leg. Is it something different with MCS? No. So the psychological aspect is the symptoms and the problems and the headaches and everything about that. And the physiological counterpart is also there. And that is what actually triggers the redness of the skin and so on. So I have never, adhered to the idea that MCS is a purely psychological condition, because there are no purely psychological conditions. Even though we cannot today observe the underlying things that goes on inside the body of a person experiencing MCS symptoms, we know that they are there. And I know it even though I haven't done any studies on it, because it would be very odd if that would not be the case. With that out of the question, so I do think that there are obvious physiological changes in the body. And if there are, I'm certain that if we study people long enough and with good enough methods, we can actually understand what it is that triggers these symptoms. And we have actually tried that. Let me just briefly change the scenery, because I'm actually sitting in my lab now. So if I tilt my screen, here is the chemical generating aspect of our lab. So here we have a syringe pump that kind of triggers chemicals into a stream of air, and it goes into one of our exposure chambers here. So we have actually built it, and you can see that it's quite spacious. It looks a bit like an old phone booth, but it's a lot of windows so that people feel comfortable sitting in there. In there, we can make very well-controlled exposure. And one of the things that we have found, which is one of the papers that I sent you, is that whereas many think that people with MCS are just reacting to anything, that is not actually the case. So if we, in one of our studies, we selected a compound, a trigeminal compound that we know a lot of people with MCS actually react to. It's a compound called acrolein, which is present in kind of combustion products. So if you light a match and you can feel the burning sensation, that is at least in part having to do with acrolein. Acrolein is detected by humans at very low levels, and for many individuals that is not a concern because they don't really feel anything. But when we increase the dose, we get runny eyes and it stings us a bit. So what we did was that we made a study where we asked ourselves, is it actually the case that people with MCS or chemical intolerance react differently to masked exposures of acrolein? So then we had two conditions in this exposure booth that you can see. In one of the conditions, we exposed people only to an odorant that actually is quite mild and that doesn't trigger reactions in MCS patients. And the other contained mixture of the mild odorant and acrolein. And then we tested two different groups, one with MCS and one without MCS. The group without MCS could not discern any difference between the two exposure conditions. So it is not detectable in general by the general public that doesn't have any problems. But the MCS group actually could. So they could, but they could do so only after extended exposure. So we had to expose people for 45 minutes or something like that to actually get a symptom reaction. But when they did, they sat inside that booth and they had red skin and so on. This proves to us that it is not only, if it would have been an expectancy effect, if we would have taken in the MCS patients, it's a common trope that MCS persons react to anything, but then they would have reacted to the mild odorant, but they didn't. They only reacted to the masked compound. So that kind of says to us that based on these kind of exposures, we could potentially be able to find a test to be able to tease out people who actually react to this and those who don't. That could be step one into attaching an exposure test to to MCS in the same way that we do, for instance, in allergies. If you think that you have an allergy, you come to the hospital and they do a skin prick test and you say, okay, I have a reaction to pollen, birch pollen, and I have a reaction to cat dandruff, but I don't have a reaction to hazelnuts. And then you can get that kind of palette of exposure that I spoke about previously.
What disturbs me, and I think many people with MCS, is when research is published that present what I think is a false argument that multiple chemical sensitivity, chemical intolerance, is a psychological condition, disorder, solely, right? It does feel that researchers, A, have an agenda, those researchers, and it's informed by their training, right? And those researchers draw on papers in psychology and panic disorder. So it feels like they begin with an outcome in mind. And do they actually talk to people with MCS, unlike you do? You work very closely with people with MCS. I think often they don't, and that's troubling. So it brings to mind the saying, nothing about us without us. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think at least your final statement, I think, is very important. I think it's key to actually involve the patients in the research. But I would also say that it's not necessarily true that they haven't met MCS patients. I think that they have, however, met them in situations where they haven't been able to observe the exposure reactions. Patient has trickled down in the health system and they end up at a psychologist, because everyone who has a reaction that cannot be explained along the way end up at psychologists. And the psychologists see that this person is not feeling so well, and that may be obvious because they have traveled this path and haven't gotten any help. And when they speak to that person, they are using their framework based on their training to do what they can do for them. And it could be that they end up in a kind of a narrow frame of explaining MCS symptoms. And I do understand the frustration of MCS patients because they aren't particularly stressed. They aren't, depressed. They could be after they have had this problem for a while, but that is not the main concern. And I would say that you should go back and actually address the main concern, which is, in my opinion, the relationship between an exposure and a symptom.
Absolutely.
That's where research should be. I do understand the kind of outrage of the current state of business.
We need folks who take us at our word, right? We need researchers to collaborate with us and believe us. And we need doctors and human resource people to take us at our word and not misdiagnose and dismiss us. And we need family and loved ones to be supportive. And we need more researchers like you who collaborate and study the science. I'd like to ask you, what motivates you to keep going?
I work at the psychology department. So I understand the initial concern that I will dismiss their reactions as psychological. I'm not doing that. I really, I have devoted a lot of my life towards helping patients with MCS. And I do it because, first of all, someone has to do it. And it doesn't seem like anyone else is doing it. So I'm soldiering on. And it's a lot of problems. You regularly get mails and calls from both people who are really bad off and just want my help. And I feel horrible for not being able to help them yet because I'm just one person in a very large world. I get a lot of anger, people calling me and saying that I'm a horrible person for, doing my research. And I hope they have misinterpreted me. I also get a lot of love. So people say that what you're doing is, I feel hope for the future. I think it's my duty to do this. I just happen to find it also very thrilling and very interesting. I don't suffer from MCS myself, so I have the privilege of actually not getting these symptoms, but I do see the suffering and I want to help.
Yeah. And lastly, you mentioned you're a professor in a department of psychology. Even by reaching out to you and inviting you on the podcast, I look closely at your research to ensure that you are not dismissing people with MCS and negating our lived experiences. And I was delighted to see and to hear that you're not. But that is quite, in my experience, quite rare among psychologists.
Among non-informed psychologists, I would say that there are actually psychologists who do not endorse an explanation that this is just a kind of a sub-symptom of anxiety and so on. I would even go as far as to say that in some cases, it's the toxicologists who are trying to push the MCS patients away from their field because they haven't found a dose-response relationship, and therefore it should be psychological in nature. But you asked me about my background, so I'm not a clinical psychologist. I have a background in cognitive neuroscience, focusing on the sensory system. So I do a lot of studies on the nervous system from the periphery, the inflammation in the mucosal membranes, and systemic reaction, like taking blood samples to look for signs of inflammation and gene expression alterations. I follow the activation patterns in the brain when people are exposed to chemical compounds. I look at potential effects of key oxidative stress symptoms, like some of these I have mentioned before. So I have a quite broad neurobiological background, and with my colleagues at the hospital and my close colleague Anna Sarklason with a background in chemistry, I think we cover a large and important field of expertise.